the night of April 26, 1717. Somewhere off the coast of Cape Cod, a ship was carrying more stolen wealth than any vessel that had ever sailed the Atlantic. Gold dust stripped from West African traders, silver bars looted from Spanish merchants, jewels, ivory, and the plunder of over 50 captured ships, all packed into one groaning hold. The man who commanded that ship was 28 years old. He had been a pirate for barely 14 months. He had never lost a single ship. His crew had voted him their captain. And in less than 1 year, he had become the single wealthiest outlaw in recorded human history. His name was Samuel Bellamy. They called him Black Sam. And tonight, the sea was going to take everything. This is not the story of Blackbeard, the pirate of children's books and theme parks. This is not the story of Captain Kidd, the privateer turned scapegoat. This is the true story of the most successful pirate who ever lived, a man who built a floating democracy worth over $120 million in modern value, who robbed the rich to feed the forgotten, and who vanished beneath the waves before the world could catch him. Drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching from? And hit subscribe, because we're going deep on Black Sam Bellamy. Samuel Bellamy was born in 1689 in Hiddesley, a farming village in Devon, England, a place so small that ambition itself must have felt like a foreign language. He was the sixth child of a farmer, born into a world of rigid class walls where your father's job was your destiny. The only crack in those walls was the sea. Devon had a maritime tradition stretching back to the days of Sir Francis Drake. The Royal Navy recruited from its coastal towns. The merchant fleet drew sailors from its ports. And so, like thousands of Devon men before him, young Bellamy found his way to the water. The historical record of his early years is thin. He moves through it like a ghost. But we know he served on naval vessels during the War of the Spanish Succession, the brutal, decade-long conflict that turned tens of thousands of men into hardened sailors. Then, in 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht ended the war, and those tens of thousands of trained fighting men were discharged. No pension, no land, no future, just their calluses and their resentment. They were the raw material of the golden age of piracy. Samuel Bellamy was 24 years old, broke and furious. He was also, by every account that survives, brilliant. Around 1715, Bellamy arrived in New England and made his way to the town of Eastham on Cape Cod. There, he met a girl named Maria Hallett, the daughter of a local farming family. She was, by every account that survived 3 centuries, beautiful, sharp-minded, and completely unreachable for a penniless English sailor with nothing to offer her parents. They began a relationship anyway. The relationship produced a child. The child died in infancy, and Maria Hallett, not Bellamy, never Bellamy, was imprisoned by the Puritan community of Eastham for what they called lewdness, the bearing of a child outside marriage. She was eventually released, but she spent years afterward living at the edges of Eastham society, the subject of whispers so dark that local folklore eventually transformed her into something supernatural. Goody Hallett, the sea witch of Wellfleet, the woman who called up storms. Bellamy watched the woman he loved be punished for something they had done together, while he faced no consequences whatsoever. His response was not shame. It was rage. He told people he would come back wealthy enough to marry Maria on his own terms. That poverty, the specific grinding poverty that had made him invisible to her family, was the obstacle. And he was going to remove it. He had no idea how far he would actually go. Bellamy partnered with a man named Palsgrave Williams, the son of a Rhode Island merchant family, a trained goldsmith with some capital and a lot of restless energy. The two men had a plan: sail to Florida, dive the wrecked Spanish treasure fleet that had been devastated by a hurricane in 1715 near what is now Sebastian Inlet, and come up rich. It did not work. The Spanish had already armed salvage vessels guarding the site. The best material was gone. The unofficial salvagers, competing for scraps from across the Atlantic, included Bellamy and Williams, and they came away with essentially nothing. They were now in the Caribbean, broke, with no prospects and no way home. The step from there to piracy was not a moral collapse. It was arithmetic. In 1716, Bellamy and Williams joined the crew of Benjamin Hornigold, one of the founding fathers of the golden age of piracy, and the man who would later recruit the sailor who became Blackbeard. Hornigold operated from Nassau in the Bahamas, under a loose coalition of pirates who called themselves the Flying Gang. Samuel Bellamy had found his world. From the moment Bellamy took command of his own crew in 1716, something became clear. This was not an ordinary pirate. The pirate articles, the codes of conduct that governed the Flying Gang's ships, were already more democratic than anything in the legitimate world. Every man had a vote on major decisions. The captain could be removed. The quartermaster, not the captain, controlled distribution of plunder. Every man received a share. Bellamy took those principles further than anyone else. His crew was the most diverse workforce on the Atlantic: English, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, French, Dutch, African, Caribbean sailors. Men who had been pressed into the Royal Navy against their will. Men who had been enslaved. Men who had been paid starvation wages in the merchant fleet with no voice and no recourse. On Bellamy's ship, they had a vote. They had a share. They had dignity. Bellamy understood this was radical, and he said so explicitly. When he captured a merchant captain named Beer who refused to join the pirates on moral grounds, Bellamy gave a speech that the journalist who recorded it could barely contain. He told Beer that the merchants and governors who robbed the poor under cover of law were the real thieves, that Bellamy's men were free men who robbed openly and answered to no master. He called himself a free prince. The speech may have been polished in the retelling, but its philosophy, that the system itself was the crime, runs through everything Bellamy did. He didn't just raid ships. He recruited from them. Many men chose to join him. And his fleet grew fast. By early 1717, Bellamy needed a flagship worthy of what he was building. He found it in February of that year, the Whydah galley. The Whydah was not just any ship. It had been purpose-built in London in 1715 as a slave vessel, fast, heavily armed, designed to transport enslaved Africans from the West African coast to the Caribbean while fighting off pirates. The dark irony that this instrument of human trafficking would become the most celebrated pirate ship in history is not lost on historians. On its second voyage, now loaded with sugar, indigo, ivory, and gold dust from the Caribbean, it crossed paths with Bellamy's growing fleet near the Bahamas. The chase lasted 3 days. The Whydah was fast. Bellamy's fleet was faster and more numerous. Captain Lawrence, Prince of the Whydah, eventually accepted the inevitable and surrendered. Bellamy, in a move that was notably generous, even by his own standards, gave Prince the Sultana, his existing flagship, in fair exchange. He then transferred his flag to the Whydah, armed it with additional cannon from captured prizes until it carried 28 guns, and made it the command vessel of what was now a genuine fleet. The Whydah, the Mary Ann, the Fisher, and several smaller sloops. Somewhere between 150 and 200 men sailed under Bellamy's flag. He had, in roughly 14 months, risen from a broke sailor on a Caribbean beach to the commander of the most powerful pirate fleet in the Atlantic. He was 28 years old. He had never lost a ship, and the hold of the Whydah was stuffed with the plunder of over 50 prize vessels, gold, silver, jewels, ivory, trade goods. A fortune that historians estimate at over $120 million in today's value. Some say more if this story has you hooked, and it should, because we are just getting to the part where everything goes wrong. Make sure you hit subscribe and ring that bell. We cover the histories they don't teach you in school, the stories that fell through the cracks of official records and landed somewhere between legend and truth. And tell me in the comments, if you were sailing with Black Sam in 1717, what would your pirate name be? I read every single one. Now, back to the Whydah and the storm that was already building on the horizon. In April of 1717, Bellamy turned his fleet north. The historical record doesn't give us a single definitive reason, but the most consistent reading of everything we know points to one destination: Cape Cod. Maria Hallett. He had been gone roughly 2 years. He had the wealth he had promised to return with. He was going home. He came north along the American coastline, still taking prizes as he went. Near Virginia, he captured the Mary Ann, a small vessel carrying Madeira wine, pressing her crew into reluctant service and adding her to his convoy. He was, by every measure, at the absolute peak of his power. He reached the waters off Cape Cod on the night of April 26, 1717. The weather had been deteriorating all day. A northeast wind was building, and the northeast is the most dangerous direction for sailing vessels approaching the Cape Cod coast. The prevailing current runs south along the outer beach. The shoals extend much further offshore than the charts of the period showed. Bellamy's pilots knew the waters were hazardous. What they could not know from the open ocean in building seas at night, was exactly where the shoals began. The storm hit with full force around midnight. It was a nor'easter, the kind of storm Cape Cod residents had lived with and feared for generations. The winds reached hurricane force. The seas built to heights that made seamanship essentially impossible. The Whydah, heavy with treasure, with its rows of cannon, with the dead weight of 50 ships worth of plunder, rode dangerously low in the water. The combination of wind and wave and current pushed it toward the outer beach. In the early hours of April 27, 1717, the Whydah struck a shoal off Wellfleet. The impact was catastrophic. The storm seas began breaking over the hull immediately. A ship that had outrun every pursuer, that had survived the Middle Passage and 3 days of chase and 100 storms, came apart in the surf within minutes. Of approximately 140 men aboard the Whydah, 2 survived. Thomas Davis, a Welsh carpenter who had been forced into Bellamy's crew and had repeatedly petitioned to be released, made it to shore. John Julian, a Mosquito Indian from Central America and one of the most experienced sailors aboard, also survived. Every other man on the Whydah died in the surf or on the beach. Samuel Bellamy's body was recovered on the beach in the days that followed. He was identified by his clothing, his black coat, the pistols at his belt. He was 28 years old. He had been a pirate captain for 14 months. The companion vessels were caught in the same storm. The Mary Ann wrecked near Poche Island, and her crew, including those involuntary wine merchants who had been pressed into service and wanted nothing more than to prove their innocence, was captured and brought to Boston for trial. The Admiralty Court proceedings that followed produced some of the most detailed first-hand documentation of Bellamy's operations that exists. 7 men were hanged at Charlestown Ferry in November of 1717. their bodies displayed in chains on the waterfront as a warning to anyone else considering the profession. The involuntary captives were released. Thomas Davis, the forced Welsh carpenter, was acquitted, his story consistent and corroborated. John Julian, the Mosquito Indian who had survived the wreck. The man whose seamanship may have been the reason either survivor made it to shore, was never tried. He was sold into slavery. The racial mathematics of colonial New England treated his survival not as a legal question, but as a property one. His subsequent fate is not documented anywhere that has survived, which is itself a kind of documentation. And Maria Hallett? She survived. She lived into middle age in the Eastham and Wellfleet area. She never married. She occupied an increasingly isolated position in the community. The folklore that grew around her grew darker with time. She became, in Cape Cod oral tradition, the sea witch who had called up the storm, the woman who had bargained with the devil for revenge on the man who abandoned her. These are the stories that communities tell about women who survive on their own terms. The truth underneath the legend is both simpler and more devastating. A 17-year-old girl was used and abandoned by a man who promised to come back rich. The man died with the tide on his way to her. And she never knew, not for certain, whether to grieve or rage. The Whydah lay on the bottom of the Atlantic, in approximately 14 to 16 feet of water off Wellfleet, for 269 years. Local salvagers had picked over the wreck in the immediate aftermath. Various attempts at systematic recovery had been made over the centuries, but the shifting sands of the outer cape continuously buried and reburied what remained. In 1984, a treasure hunter named Barry Clifford located the main deposit of the Whydah's wreckage using archival research and underwater survey techniques. In 1985, a bronze bell was pulled from the site. On it, an inscription, "The Whydah Galley, 1717." That inscription confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt that this was Bellamy's flagship. The excavation that followed over the next 4 decades recovered tens of thousands of artifacts, cannon and rigging hardware, navigation instruments, personal effects, shoes, combs, a child's stocking that may have belonged to a young boy pressed into service, coins from across the Atlantic world, Spanish reals, English shillings, West African gold dust that had come aboard in the Whydah's slave trading days. The Whydah collection is now the only fully authenticated pirate treasure in the world. Not artifacts associated with pirates, confirmed, archaeologically documented material from a known vessel in a known historical event. It is housed at a museum in Provincetown, Massachusetts, within sight of the waters where the Whydah went down. It is the most complete physical record of the golden age of piracy anywhere on Earth. Samuel Bellamy's legacy rests on 3 things. First, the scale. In 14 months, he accumulated more wealth than any other documented pirate in history. The fortune in the Whydah's hold represented the consolidation of 50 prize ships' cargoes. In 1717 terms, it was enough to buy several large English estates. In today's terms, over $120 million. Some historians say more. Second, the philosophy. The speech to Captain Beer. The Democratic Articles. The consistent pattern of treating captured sailors differently depending on how their own officers had treated them, releasing the abused, recruiting the willing. These are not the actions of a man who thought of himself as merely a thief. Bellamy was a class warrior who happened to operate on the ocean. He understood that the system he had been born into was arbitrary, unjust, and sustained by violence, and his piracy was his proof. Third, the ship itself. Because the Whydah sank in shallow water and was eventually recovered, Bellamy is the only Golden Age pirate whose story can be told in material terms rather than purely through documents. The artifacts in Provincetown are evidence, physical, concrete evidence, of how a diverse crew of men from across the Atlantic world lived, worked, and died in the most radical workplace democracy available to them in their time. He was 28 years old. He had been a pirate for 14 months. He was the richest outlaw who ever lived. And he died with the tide, still miles from shore, still on his way back to a girl on Cape Cod, who spent the rest of her life not knowing what had happened to him. Black Sam Bellamy didn't just steal gold, he stole the idea that the world's rules were fixed. For 14 months, on a ship in the middle of the ocean, he proved they weren't. And the sea, which owes nothing to anyone, took him anyway. I'm your name, this is your channel. If this story hit you the way it hit me the first time I read it, share it with someone who needs to know that the most interesting people in history are never the ones in the textbooks. Subscribe, drop a comment, and I'll see you in the next one. Keep a weather eye on the horizon.